Step into the whirlwind of Napoleon's empire with Military Memoirs from 1804 to 1814 by Raymond Aimery de Montesquiou-Fezensac, a gripping first-hand account of Europe's most iconic military campaigns. From the triumphs of Austerlitz to the frozen retreat from Moscow, this memoir thrusts you into the heart of the action. These are his words. Let's begin. I do not intend to recount the Peninsular War, rightly called the War of Independence, as I was present for only 3 months, November and December 1808 and January 1809. It was only during this period that Napoleon personally commanded his armies. Here is the occasion that brought me to this brief campaign. I had just gotten married. The Duke of Feltre, Minister of War and my father-in-law, constantly regretted being unable to accompany the Emperor to the front. He wished at least to be represented by his aides-de-camp. Naturally, it was not my place to request an exception. The question was in what capacity I would serve. I did not want to join a regiment that might be held in reserve or stationed in a garrison. Marshal Ney had recently been called to Spain. I was certain that under his command there would be either glory to earn or, at the very least, dangers to face. As I have previously recounted, Marshal Ney had shown me much kindness. He gave me further proof of his favour by allowing me to join this campaign as his aide-de-camp once more. I will recount what occurred before my eyes, preceded by brief observations on the overall events. For some time, French troops, under various pretexts, had occupied the main strongholds of Spain. Napoleon believed himself the master of the country when he summoned the royal family to Bayonne and forced their abdication. This news had a catastrophic effect in Spain, sparking uprisings across the land. Severe examples and initial successes by our generals at various points temporarily curbed the spread of the rebellion, but the disastrous capitulation of General Dupont at Bayonne inflamed Spanish enthusiasm and doubled the strength of the insurrection. By August, the French army had been forced back to the line of the Ebro River. Napoleon wasted no time repairing this disaster. He summoned to Spain the 1st and 6th Corps of the Grande Armée, which had remained in Germany, as well as 3 divisions of dragoons and 2 divisions from the Army of Italy. Marshal Victor and Marshal Ney retained command of the 1st and 6th Corps, respectively, while other troops were placed under the orders of Marshal Bessières, Lannes, Moncey, and Lefebvre. The passage of these corps through France was like a triumphal procession. Municipalities in every town vied with each other to host them. Everywhere, military celebrations were organized. Banquets were offered, while speeches, addresses, and patriotic songs hailed the victories of the Grand Army and predicted new ones. Alas, these hopes would be cruelly dashed. Napoleon aimed to command between 100,000 and 120,000 seasoned troops. He hoped in a few months to restore the honour of French arms, reinstall his brother on the throne in Madrid, and subdue all of Spain. He intended to return to Paris promptly, as Austria's hostile movements were already causing him some unease. Napoleon, with his characteristic energy, declared, "I sent lambs to the Spaniards and they devoured them. Now I will send wolves and they will devour in turn." Indeed, it was high time to regain the upper hand after the unexpected setbacks. The French had been driven back to the Ebro line by poorly organized Spaniards whose triumph had only intensified their hatred. General Dupont had surrendered at Bayonne, and General Junot had capitulated in Lisbon. The British army, having freed Portugal, was preparing to join forces with the Spaniards. One more push, and Spain would be entirely liberated. Here was the campaign plan adopted by the enemy. With the French army concentrated on the Ebro around Vitoria, the Spaniards attempted to encircle it by advancing on one flank toward Pamplona and on the other toward Bilbao. The left wing, comprising 45,000 men under General Blake, marched on Bilbao. The right wing, commanded by Palafox with 18,000 men, moved on Pamplona. The centre, under Castanos with 30,000 men, occupied the Ebro's right bank near Logroño and was to join the right wing when the encirclement was fully underway. Napoleon, already stationed in Vittoria, discerned the enemy's plan and welcomed it. He knew that neither the enemy's right nor left wings could withstand the resistance of his formidable troops and experienced generals. He planned to leave Vittoria, crush the enemy's wings one by one, and prevent their reunion. He even criticized his generals for engaging prematurely before his arrival. Nevertheless, these initial successes restored confidence within the French army, and Napoleon wasted no time marching on Burgos. He captured the city after routing its defenders. Meanwhile, the enemy's left wing was defeated by Marshal Victor at Espinosa on November 10th and 11th, and nearly annihilated. Shortly afterward, the right wing suffered the same fate at the Battle of Tudela on November 23rd. The remnants of this army, pursued by Marshal Lannes, retreated partly towards Zaragoza and partly along the road to Madrid under the command of Generals Castanos and Palafox. Napoleon continued his advance toward Madrid to restore King Joseph to his capital and intercept the British army, which, having landed at Santander, was advancing into Old Castile. He ordered Marshal Ney, upon reaching Aranda on the Madrid route, to move left through Osma and Soria. Ney's task was to position himself behind Castanos and Palafox, who, retreating after the defeat at Tudela, were to be attacked head-on by Marshals Lannes and Moncey, ensuring their complete destruction. It was during this time that I rejoined Marshal Ney. I crossed the border on November 10th, travelling with my horses, and on November 19th I reached Aranda on the road to Madrid. After some uncertainty regarding Marshal Ney's movements, I finally learned that he had taken the route to Soria, as I mentioned earlier, and I joined him on November 22nd in that city, passing through Osma and Belanga. I had only been in Spain for a few days, and I had already noticed the stark difference between this war and those we had previously fought. In Germany, we fought only against enemy armies. Victory made us masters of the land. The inhabitants submitted sullenly but calmly. If the disorder that we too often caused angered them, it was usually easy to win them over with kindness. Here, however, hatred was deep, fiery, and irreconcilable. One could say that the entire nation was armed against us, and we controlled only the ground occupied by our troops. The marauders in our army, quite numerous at the time, committed countless abuses. To the Spaniards, the cruelties inflicted upon us seemed like legitimate vengeance and were even sanctioned by their religion. I found in a catechism the following passage: "Is it permissible to kill the French? No, except those under Napoleon's banners." As a result, there was a rivalry of cruelty between them and us, with details that would make anyone shudder. Even in our presence, the Spaniards did not hide their feelings. A peasant, overhearing us discuss the King of Spain, dared to ask, "Which king? Yours or ours?" The officers and soldiers of our army seemed disheartened and uneasy. Accustomed to defeating the enemy on the battlefield, they understood that courage and military skill were powerless to subdue an entire population fighting for its religion and independence. At Marshal Ney's headquarters, I was warmly welcomed as usual. As I mentioned, the Marshal had been sent along this route to pursue Castanos and cut off his retreat. However, obtaining reliable intelligence was difficult in a country where the inhabitants fled at our approach or deliberately gave us false information. Marshal Ney was unaware of the outcome of the Battle of Tudela. Some even tried to make him believe that Marshal Lannes had been defeated. He also did not know the whereabouts of Castanos, who was said to command 60,000 to 80,000 men. With only 14,000 to 15,000 troops under his own command, Ney hesitated to take unnecessary risks and spent 3 days in Soria waiting for intelligence that never arrived. The Battle of Tudela had taken place on November 22nd. Had Ney marched on Agreda on the 23rd, he would have reached Castanos's rear, ensuring his total defeat. The Emperor reproached him for this with the respect due to his merit, acknowledging the reasons that might explain his hesitation. Marshal Ney then resumed his march and arrived on November 28th at Alagon, near Zaragoza, passing through Agreda and Tarazona. Marshal Moncey was in Alagon, occupied with preparations for the siege of Zaragoza. The emperor again criticized this movement, stating that Marshal Ney should not have mingled his troops with those of Marshal Montcy, who was responsible for the siege. Ney, he said, should have focused solely on pursuing Castanos. On the evening of our arrival in Alagon, November 28th, Marshal Ney called for the aide-de-camp on duty to send to the emperor's headquarters. I was on duty and was thus assigned the mission. The mission was dangerous. The emperor was advancing on Madrid via the main road from Aranda and was expected to be near the capital. The direct route through Calatayud could not be taken. I would need to retrace our path to Aranda and then follow the main road to Madrid. However, the local populations were seething with anger, and there was a high risk they would seek vengeance on an isolated officer, as had already happened too often. My comrades regarded me as doomed. This concern was even voiced to Marshal Ney, as I was not officially his aide-de-camp, but merely performing that role for this campaign. It was argued that sending me on such a perilous mission was an unfair reward for my zeal. After a moment's reflection, Marshal Ney responded that since he had mentioned one of his aides-de-camp, he could not assign the task to another officer. Furthermore, the aide-de-camp on duty was required to proceed, and I would not have allowed anyone else to take my place. The mission, he added, is undoubtedly dangerous, but less so than one might think. The local populations, still unsettled and frightened by our recent passage, have not had time to organize any coordinated action. I believe that with calmness and resolve, no one will dare to stop him. This confidence bolstered my own, and as you will see, the undertaking, though somewhat daring, was entirely successful. I departed that very evening, guided by a Spanish escort. He led me to Malian via back roads. I did not recognize the route we had taken the previous day, and I pointed this out, not without some unease. My guide explained that he had avoided the main road because it would have taken us through a village where I might have been detained. We arrived safely in Malian, and the rare loyalty of this first guide seemed like a good omen for the success of my perilous journey. From that point on, I found, at regular intervals, French cavalry posts that provided me with a horse and an escort rider. Everywhere the local populations were restless, agitated, and uncertain. Along the way I encountered many stragglers and marauders from our army corps. I scolded them for lingering behind, though deep down I was relieved to see them along my route. In Tarazona, while my horse was being saddled, a hussar accidentally discharged his pistol, immediately drawing a considerable and somewhat threatening crowd to the door. The brigadier suggested mounting and dispersing the crowd, but this would have been the surest way to get us all killed. I stopped him, and instead walked out with the hussar accompanying me. The groups parted to let us pass, and I crossed the town at a slow pace, exchanging salutes with the onlookers. Throughout my journey, I found the inhabitants in a hostile stance. Their faces bore the marks of both hatred and fear. At my approach, small groups would form, only to dissolve quickly. If I escaped unharmed, it was undoubtedly due to their fear of retaliation. On November 30th, after travelling day and night, I arrived in Aranda. I then followed the main road to Madrid. The dangers had passed since I was now among the army corps, marching in the emperor's wake. However, the post horses had been requisitioned, and there were no means of communication available. I often travelled on foot, a peculiar way to deliver dispatches. Everything along the route was devastated. There was no food or horses to be found. After crossing the battlefield of Somosierra, I finally reached the emperor on the evening of December 3rd, at the Château de Chamartin, near Madrid. The city surrendered the following day. Shortly after my departure, Marshal Ney received orders to proceed to Madrid himself via Calatayud, Sigüenza, and Guadalajara. I could not travel alone to meet him on that route. Prince de Neuchâtel kept me in Madrid until the 10th. By then, Marshal Ney was in Guadalajara. The proximity of the city allowed me to join him there without danger. It was only after 12 days that I was able to report to him on my unusual mission. All his aides de camp embraced me as though I had survived a shipwreck. Marshal Ney's corps entered Madrid on December 14th to serve as its garrison. The Emperor reviewed the corps a few days later. Ney's corps, along with that of Marshal Soult, was then tasked with pursuing the British army under General Moore, which was retreating through Leon and Galicia to embark at Corunna. Marshal Ney was to form the reserve for Marshal Soult. We departed on December 20th for Astorga, arriving there on January 2nd, having passed through Guadarrama, Tordesillas, and Rio Seco. The harsh winter weather made the crossing of the Guadarrama mountains both arduous and dangerous. The Emperor followed the same route to Astorga before returning to Valladolid. Marshal Soult, preceding us, pursued the British in their retreat, which they conducted skillfully. Soult was given Marshal Ney's light cavalry brigade, commanded by General Colbert, who was killed on January 3rd at Cacabelos during a vanguard skirmish he led with his customary daring. This news caused us great sorrow. All of Marshal Ney's aides-de-camp were devoted to General Colbert, who always treated them with the utmost kindness. It has been said that Colbert expressed regret at being taken so early from the promising career ahead of him, but this is inaccurate. He was killed without uttering a word. Marshal Soult continued his pursuit of the British without calling on Marshal Ney's assistance. Ney remained in reserve, stationed alternately at Astorga and Lugo. After losing the Battle of Corunna, the British embarked on January 17th and 18th, leaving behind 6,000 men, 3,000 horses, and a considerable amount of equipment during their retreat. The British departure left us in control of the region. Marshal Ney was tasked with occupying Galicia, while Marshal Soult moved closer to the Portuguese border. I spent 8 days in Lugo. Just as I was about to depart for Corunna, Marshal Ney encouraged me to return to Paris to take part in the upcoming campaign against Austria. He suggested delaying my departure by a few days if I wished to see Corunna, but I declined, and rightly so. There was no time to lose for the Austrian campaign. Moreover, 8 days after my departure, communications were cut off, and all our posts were massacred. Saint-Simon, one of the Marshal's aides-de-camp who was also returning to France, accompanied me. I was fortunate to have such a companion for a journey that was long, arduous, and dangerous. Our trip turned out to be quieter than we had dared to hope. Everywhere we went, correspondence posts provided us with horses, and we arrived in Valladolid on February 1st. Post relays then took us to Bayonne and finally to Paris. Campaign in Germany in 1809. I had just returned from Spain when I had to leave Paris again for this new campaign. The Prince of Neuchâtel was kind enough to attach me to his aides-de-camp. I was a captain and aide-de-camp to the Duke of Feltre, my father-in-law. I will not write a detailed journal, as it would offer little interest, having had no specific mission. I merely followed the Grand Headquarters. I will only provide a few notes to complete the account of my military history. This campaign followed so quickly on the heels of the Spanish campaign that initially the Emperor had almost no one with him, and we arrived one after another, without horses or equipment. It was quite a sight to see officers of the Grand Headquarters mounted on peasant horses, while other officers of the Emperor's civilian household zealously and efficiently filled the roles of those who had not yet arrived. I joined the Emperor on the first battlefield at Abensberg, April 20th. 2 days later at Eckmühl, General Cavoni was killed by my side. I witnessed the deep regret the Emperor expressed for this former comrade in arms. After the capture of Regensburg, I followed the headquarters to Vienna. During the engagement at Aspern, May 21st, I was sent to General Nansuti and received a severe contusion on my left knee, which forced me to retreat to Vienna and prevented me from attending the Battle of Essling the next day, May 22nd. The time that passed before hostilities resumed allowed me to recover, and I was present at Wagram and during the subsequent operations until the armistice at Znaim. As a reward for my willingness, and perhaps more for what I wished to achieve than for what I actually accomplished, the Emperor promoted me to squadron leader and made me a Baron of the Empire, granting me an endowment of 4,000 francs in Hanover. Mission to the Army of Catalonia in 1811. In August 1811, I was sent on a mission to Marshal, Duke of Tarentum, who commanded the Army of Catalonia. He had recently recaptured the fortress of Figueres, which had been taken by surprise by the enemy following a brilliant siege. My instructions required me to visit Girona, Barcelona, and Montserrat. The Marshal informed me that to reach Girona, I would need the escort of a battalion, for Barcelona, the escort of a division, and for Montserrat, I could only go when the entire army moved closer. Nevertheless, I had been ordered to undertake the mission without regard for these difficulties. Such was the ignorance or deliberate disregard of Spain's true situation at that time. I remained at headquarters for a month, limiting my visits to Figueres and its surroundings. Upon my return to Paris, I wrote the attached report. Report on Catalonia and the state of the army. The war in Catalonia, even more than in the rest of Spain, presents challenges that seem almost insurmountable. These difficulties stem from the nature of the region and the methods used, and still being used, to subdue it. The spirit of the region is entirely opposed to us. The Catalans are proud and hostile to any form of subjugation, having been almost perpetually at war or in rebellion. They have harboured a hatred for the French since the War of the Spanish Succession. They consider themselves superior to other Spaniards, with their language further separating them. They display even greater stubbornness in their opinions and a stronger reverence for clergy and zeal for religion. Such was their disposition at the start of the war. It was with extortion, brigandage of all kinds, ill treatment, outright cruelty, and contempt for their religious practices that efforts were made to subdue them. Is it any wonder that they harbour profound hatred and aversion for the French? Both have reached their peak, and I believe it is no exaggeration to say that we have no friends in all of Catalonia. Attempts to win them over are impossible, leaving only brute force as the means of subjugation. However, this path is no less fraught with difficulty. Catalonia, spanning nearly 200 square leagues, has an extensive coastline, is covered with mountains, crisscrossed by countless streams, and has few roads. Such a region offers significant defensive advantages to insurgents supported by the British. The challenge of obtaining supplies is another major obstacle. One cannot expect to find substantial resources in the local harvests. While Catalonia was once well cultivated, producing wheat, rye, maize, olive oil, wine, and more, the region never grew enough wheat to meet its consumption needs. How could this year's harvest sustain the army, especially considering the reduced population and the portions seized by the insurgents? Catalonia is in a state of perpetual insurrection. We control only the areas we physically occupy, and travel anywhere requires large escorts. Despite this, the insurgents have made no real progress in tactics or discipline. They lack brilliance on the battlefield and are defeated in every encounter, even when we are outnumbered. Yet each individual seems to possess an indomitable will to resist. Defeats only heighten their resolve, successes embolden them, and there is no foreseeable end to their struggle. The surprise capture of the fortress at Figueres had greatly raised their hopes. Through the unbelievable negligence of the governor, the treachery of a few Spaniards inside the fortress, and the cowardice of the Neapolitan defenders, the insurgents seized the fort through a small gate without resistance. The Duke of Tarentum was in Barcelona at the time. Initially all seemed lost, and the Catalans believed the French would be driven out of Spain. However, these events had no serious consequences. The Duke of Tarentum immediately returned to besiege the fort. All the insurgents' attempts to break the siege or escape were in vain. General Barragay-Dillier defeated them decisively, and the fort finally surrendered after a blockade during which the French troops displayed intelligence and bravery beyond all praise. After the capitulation, it became necessary to give some rest to the troops, who were utterly exhausted from the blockade. The army took up quarters around Figueres, where the headquarters were established. The emperor's intention was for the army to move toward Barcelona or Montserrat, but the enormous number of sick soldiers made any movement impossible. No more than 4,000 men could be assembled, and such a small force, constantly harassed by insurgents along the way, would have been entirely decimated. The army's excellent spirit deserves the highest praise, and it would be unjust to single out specific regiments or officers, as all competed in activity, courage, and intelligence. The army confidently awaits the emperor's benevolence for the rewards it so well deserves. The insurgents are strong along the coast, with their headquarters in Mataró under the command of General Lacy. They also have troops on the right bank of the Fluvia River at Castelfollit and Olot. They are engaged in recruiting and organising men, collecting contributions, and working to fortify Urgel and Cardona. Before undertaking the siege of these two locations, we will need to build artillery roads from Manresa to Cardona and from Belva to Urgel. The British appear constantly along the coast to support the insurgents and disrupt coastal shipping. Their occupation of the Medes Islands has greatly hindered this maritime activity. We had a post in the tower on the central island. It was easy to foresee that the enemy would attempt to dislodge us, and the marshal ordered a reconnaissance in the area. The artillery officers sent there reported that it would be impossible to set up batteries on the large island nearest the coast, as it was very steep. Based on this report, it was believed that the post on the second island was secure. However, the enemy built a battery overnight on the large island, despite the supposed impossibility. The tower we occupied on the neighbouring island was destroyed in an instant, forcing our post to surrender. Since then, the enemy has fortified the large island, destroying walls and constructing batteries. This unfortunate event has made coastal shipping in the area extremely difficult. Communication has been interrupted. The road along the sea has been completely destroyed. As for the Austerlitz route, the insurgents have destroyed it at various points, and it can only be traversed with the entire army. Nevertheless, from time to time, spies bring news from Barcelona. General Maurice Mathieu maintained excellent order and surveillance there. As the insurgents frequently tried to cut the aqueduct, supplying the city with water from the Besot River, a redoubt was constructed near Moncada to counter their efforts. Baron de Eroles, commanding the insurgents in that area, resolved to take the redoubt in September. General Mathieu, having been warned, marched out with 1,500 men from the garrison and engaged the enemy, who numbered 3,000 regular troops and a large number of peasants. Despite the disparity, the enemy was repelled and pursued to Ripoll. Barcelona is estimated to be provisioned until the end of the year, except for meat, which has only been distributed to the garrison on Sundays for some time. It is therefore crucial to replenish supplies soon. Coastal shipping faces significant challenges, especially with the disruptions caused by the British. The land route is impassable due to damaged roads. The only viable option is a maritime expedition. The inhabitants of Barcelona are as hostile to us as those in the rest of Catalonia. During the Duke of Tarentum's stay there, the residents lit fires on the terraces of their houses at night to signal the insurgents. Despite the most severe threats and police investigations, it was impossible to prevent this collusion or identify the culprits. News from General Frere's division, which stretched from Montserrat to Lerida, was very difficult to obtain. This state of affairs leaves little hope, as has been said, for restoring order. To overcome such obstacles, a large, perfectly disciplined army, led by experienced generals, focused on the public good, would be required. Above all, the leader of this army must be of unimpeachable integrity, demonstrating leniency without weakness and firmness without cruelty. The army should be paid directly from French funds, without having to rely on the slow and uncertain collection of contributions. Moreover, efforts should be made to convince the Spanish people that their welfare is a priority, that they are respected and valued, and that their happiness is a concern. Perhaps through consistent good treatment, those alienated by harsh measures could be won over. With time, it might be possible to heal such deep and festering wounds. That concludes the 9th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.